unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. One of the most remarkable developments in Indian politics in recent years is the surge in women's voter turnout. For the first several decades after independence, women's participation on Election Day lagged men's by between 8 to 12 percentage points. In recent years, however, that gender gap has completely disappeared. In state after state, women are turning out to vote with greater frequency than men. But this good news story obscures a puzzling fact. While Indian women vote at high rates, they are markedly less involved than men in politics between elections. A new book by the political scientist Soledad Artiz Prillaman gives us an explanation of exactly why. Soledad is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University and the author of an award-winning new book, The Patriarchal Political Order, The Making and Unraveling of the Gendered Participation Gap in India. To talk more about gender in politics and what can be done to ensure women have a seat at the table even when the electoral spotlight is off, I'm pleased to welcome Sole to the show for the very first time. Sole, it's good to see you and congrats on the book.
Thanks, Milan. Good to see you and thanks for a lovely introduction.
I want to start, as I often do when I speak with authors, to ask you about this book origin story. It documents this kind of patriarchal political order that exists in India, and then unravels it by demonstrating the power of public policy and women's action to test or to challenge that dominant political order. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of your argument, tell us a little bit about what inspired you personally to take on this issue of women's participation in politics in between elections.
Yeah, so Milan, this is where you start to unpack my secrets and realize that I started all of this without really knowing what I was going to do.
Which is, to be fair, the way that every dissertation turned into book should start, right?
And, I agree with that because the answer is I figured out that this was the story that needed to be told after spending time in the field, after understanding what the world of women in rural Madhya Pradesh looked like and where our existing understanding of political behavior fell short in explaining the constraints and challenges they faced. And I got to that point because I went into the field, into this research, trying to understand the impact of microcredit on politics. And that just became immediately clear was just inextricable from gender, as microcredit is now built on women's groups. But the understandings that we have, the frameworks that we have to think through why the provision of credit and finance might impact women's political behavior, we can talk about this if you're interested, but just proved to be completely divorced from what I was observing on the ground. And so as I talked to women, as I heard their stories, as I got to observe their realities, it became clear that I had no idea how to make sense of them. And so that became what I felt I was supposed to do with this project. And that's really where, the puzzle that motivates this book didn't really emerge until the end, that women vote but don't participate in politics otherwise. And it was in unpacking the reality of the political lives of the, many women who so graciously gave me their time, that became, the focal point of the study.
So let me take this back even further then. What prompted you to kind of land up in Madhya Pradesh to study microfinance and women's self-help groups?
Yeah. Okay. The real origin story. I feel like the answer to that is not so straightforward. I don't even know that I have a great answer to that. I wanted to study. I had been fascinated by the microfinance movement for a while, but even further back than that, I had wanting to understand the politics of India is something that I feel like I'd been puzzled by, something I wanted to focus on. It's part of why I went to grad school. I'm asked a lot why it is that I decided to focus on India. And I find it's very hard to give an answer to that. The answer that is probably most satisfying, but would require getting into my psyche, is that my grandfather studied Indian politics and lived through independence
Oh,
in
wow.
India. My mom was almost born in India, and he was a political philosopher, but studying the constitution writing process. But he died when I was very young. And so I grew up with their stories of being in India in the 50s, the 40s, and the 50s. But I didn't actually get to experience that with him. But I'm sure that like having Indian politics as a part of my formative experience led me to want to study or think about India more generally. And then, as I came into my own understandings of the world, questions around development more generally, around inequality, and how, a country as diverse and vast as India grapples with both development amidst like social inequalities, just was something that fascinated me. And but I've also always been someone who cares and just finds my center in engaging with people. And so thinking about the very micro, like what are the ways that this manifests in day-to-day life, I think led me to, at the time, this was really when microcredit had just kind of already surged and boomed. We just had, the Nobel Prize go out to Muhammad Yunus. And so I think that like took my 20-year-old brain into sort of a fascination. That's what led me and propelled me to go to grad school in the first place. And so it's a complicated origin story of myself and my family, I suspect, that led me to that moment when I'm in Delhi talking to a bunch of NGOs, and one of those NGOs, Pradhan, which we could talk a lot about because they've been just critical in the research that I've done, and in my own formation of thinking. But they're the ones who then took me to Madhya Pradesh, and it was in spending time working with them. That's what then centered me in MP itself. So long answer.
No, well, I think each of us has our own kind of unique, torturous backstory of how we ended up studying Indian politics. And I think for people who are out there who are thinking about going to graduate school or maybe in the middle of a PhD program, just know that you are not alone when you're out there struggling to figure out what your dissertation topic is going to be. And it's going to come to you probably in the most haphazard of ways. And I think what you've just proven, Soleil, in my experience is exactly the same, is that is not unusual or abnormal. I started at the top, Soleil, by talking a little bit about this huge surge we've seen recently in women's electoral participation. And at the top, to kind of motivate the book, you talk a lot about how if you keep voting to one side, women are much less politically active than men in India. And one of the pieces of data you cite is data from the World Values Survey, right, which surveys people in countries all around the world, using a standardized set of questions. And what that survey turns up is that only 1 in 5 women in India reported engaging in political actions other than voting. So I just want to pause on this kind of bucket of issues that are kind of political in nature but not voting. Tell us a little bit about what these non-voting political actions kind of look like, feel like, so we kind of understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think this is really important because so much of the energy of political scientists thinks about voting. I mean, elections are critical and important, and it's such a merited thing. But if we think about, how many days there are between elections, many people remain political citizens in between, and the actions that you take in between those elections may have an even more direct bearing on the benefits that you get access to, on your political outcomes in your political life. So what are those actions that are taken? I'll talk about the context I study, which is rural India, but we can imagine this in any context people are sitting in, because I think that what makes it challenging to study non-electoral participation is that it's very context specific, the ways that you can engage. But in rural India, where village and local governance is so central to the functioning of your life and the sort of resources you have access to, what happens in between are things, I think the most formal of which would be what is the Gram Sabha, the public assembly meeting that is constitutionally mandated to happen at several points in the year, where all eligible voters can come and, make their demands directly to their local elected officials. In theory, these are spaces that are supposed to be public fora to discuss what the allocation of budgets should look like, how schemes should be implemented. And, one of the things that we observe is that those spaces are like not just majority men, but like almost exclusively male dominated spaces. And so it's just a very obvious domain where who is present and whose voice is heard will determine a lot of the functioning of local government. But the other kinds of forms of non-electoral participation can be just approaching your local leader, making a claim on them. Gabby Crooks-Weisner has a really important book on the relevance and importance of claim making. It includes things like, those are probably the most common, but it would include going to higher level officials for claim making. It would include, I include in that definition protesting, making, attending political party activities that happen in between elections. But some of those actions are a little bit more rare in between elections. So a lot of this is really about claims making and making your voice heard outside of just through democratic accountability channels of elections.
So, when we think about gendered political behavior of various types, you note in the book that there are kind of two clusters or buckets of traditional explanations, right? You have a set of explanations that are built around kind of resource inequalities between men and women, and then a set of explanations that are built around social inequalities, traditionally between men and women. Tell us a little bit about those two kind of dominant explanations, because that's really, I think, kind of where you're intervening against the backdrop of those two venerable literatures.
Yeah, there's, the world over, there have been or remain gender gaps in participation. And so the primary, I think, argument around this is what you mentioned, that around resource inequalities. And the core of that argument is that individuals choose to act and engage in politics when the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs. And so when we think about why there would be a gender gap, it's either because the costs are different for men and women or the benefits are different. The resource argument really focuses on the cost part of that. So when I say, what are the costs of political participation? It's things like acquiring information to know what to do, how to do it, what you want. But it's also the ability to take time away from all of the other things you have going on to, hire the childcare or negotiate childcare or manage transportation to actually go and engage in politics. And resources are the things that lower those costs. Education makes it easier to acquire information. Money makes it easier to either make donations if you're in a context where campaign donations are useful, or, hire people to help care for and make your life easier. And then free time is something that enables you to take the time to do that. And so those resources have been argued to be one of the key drivers of who participates in general. And then inequalities in those resources are shown to coincide with inequalities in political participation. A lot of that work stems from work done in the U.S. And that's where we see a lot of this hold. The second big argument is, as you mentioned, around social norms. And there, I think of that as, instead of being about how an individual decides, it's about how we would see variance across societies. So in some contexts, if social norms dictate that men should dominate all spaces, as most patriarchal societies, have, but to varying degrees, then we would expect that in those societies, men are also going to be the ones who dominate politics. But if you existed in a society where social norms looked different, where, for example, it's less surprising or punishable or deviant for women to be engaged actively in politics, we might see a different allocation of behavior. And so, so a lot of the argument there is that in contexts where we have these high gender gaps, it's largely driven, or it may be driven, by the form that patriarchy takes in structuring the acceptability of political engagement for women.
Are you curious about India's economy, politics, culture, and history, and hungry for rigorous analysis of its most pressing challenges? Tune in to Ideas of India, the podcast that's becoming the go-to source for smart thinking on Indian political economy. Hosted by Shruti Rajagopalan, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You can hear from top experts in economics, law, and social sciences such as Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Anne Kruger, Arvind Panagriya, and many others. Explore cutting-edge ideas shaping India's political economy from young academic scholars, and connect with a community of forward-thinking intellectuals. Ideas of India offers invaluable insights for anyone invested in India's progress. Subscribe now to Ideas of India and be part of the conversations driving India's future. New episodes are released every 2 weeks and are available on all major podcasting platforms. Transcripts of each conversation are also available at mercatus.org/Ideas of India. So your argument in the book is somewhat different, right? And you offer a theory of what you call coercive political power. And in that, you have households that are very much front and center in explaining why it is that women behave politically in the way that they do, right? And if there were kind of one sentence to me that kind of summarizes your argument, it is that, many women participate in politics only when it serves the interest of men. And I wonder if you could just kind of unpack for us, why you've put the household front and center in your explanation of what you think is going on.
Yeah. And, I want to start by saying that I see the argument that I make as not arguing against these two foundational theories, but helping us understand how they actually manifest and building on them. It's not that resources don't matter, it's that they matter in particular ways. And it's not that norms don't matter, it's that norms structure what the way that we might think of engaging. And so I think that gets directly to your question of why the household. And, I spent most of the field work for this book was done in rural Madhya Pradesh, though I've also done some work in Bihar and Orissa as well. But when I was there, it became clear that the household was the unit at which political decisions were made. The resource argument typically assumes the individual as a unit. I, as a person, sit here and think through, do I want to vote or not? But then, often when we think about financial decisions, that's something we think of as a household decision. I sit with the people in my household to decide how we're going to spend our income because that's a sort of household good. And life in these communities for many people, their political life was much more similar to that economic decision where the household was the unit at which political decisions happened. And I think the reason for that is in part because of the social norms that create in these contexts such a strong attachment to the household where, you've got joint families and everyone is sort of co-producing work, but sort of organizing life in general. And I'm happy to talk more about what all of that means. But I think that when that fundamental sort of understanding as being different from the existing models just really changes what it means to have a gender gap if you change the unit at which you imagine people's decisions are being made. And maybe the last thing I'll just say on this is when you reassign the unit of observation to the household, what it does is it means that it's no longer just my beliefs or preferences that might shape my behavior. but the beliefs and preferences of everyone else in my household. And that starts to introduce power, which is what, we as political scientists spend a lot of time thinking about, but power now in the household. And so whose preferences are going to matter most for my political behavior is going to be a function, not just of what I want, but of who has power.
And I think, Sole, this is what is so powerful about your theory, as I think any of us who have stepped foot into India, when we think about, society, when we think about the economy, when we think about politics, we are struck with the fact that the household is often front and center, not always in ways that are particularly encouraging, but it's very much part of the facts of life. One thing I just want to press you on a little bit is how the household interacts with politics, right? Because one of the things you say in the book is because men typically dominate the household, not always, but under most scenarios, they end up dominating the politics of the household as well, right? So when we think of an act like voting, and I know your book is largely not about voting, but when we think about something like voting, why isn't it that the secret ballot, right, the sanctity of going to the polling booth, deciding to press that button for whoever, whichever party you whichever candidate, without anyone else knowing, why isn't that enough to give women the autonomy over their political decision making?
Yeah, I want to take a quick detour because I think it's important to answer this question, which is to get into the part of the argument that's about how the household can be coercive. And so in a world where everyone has equal power or has the ability to leave the household and can do exactly as they want, then you're going to work with the household to make political decisions insofar as it serves you. If it makes you better off, because you now don't have to bear all those costs that I've already mentioned of participation, you will organize, coordinate, figure out who's going to go to that meeting and represent my interests, and you're going to trust that they're going to do it, and it will be efficient, and everyone will be better off. In which case, you could go, if you disagree, you'll go into the ballot box and you'll vote for who you want. But the reality for many women is that you don't show up to that decision with equal power or the ability to walk away unscathed. One of the things that was really striking to me as I dug more and more, and as I had conversations with women more and more, was the regularity with which violence and fear were a part of that discussion. And so this is why, I think it's important to introduce the idea of coercion into this, which is, the reason. So coercion means that I may not want to agree with the family. It might actually not be in my interest to do so, but I may have to do so because I will face some sort of threat or punishment if I don't. And in a world where politics is power, where politics brings resources, those in the household who have power have incentives to coerce others to do what they want because it makes them better off. But then you still ask the right question. Okay, well, but once you step in the ballot box, you're alone, it's secret. How will they know? And I think that this is where, for me, what is important is to think through what coercion can mean. And I think the most obvious is what I've already described. It's like explicit punishment. If I do what I'm not supposed to do, I get punished. I'm afraid I will face violence, in which case I'm going to do what I'm going to do. But, if I can hide it, I'll get away with other things. But I think the reality of it is that kind of coercion only exists when real coercion has failed. The threat of punishment should be enough to keep you from doing the things you're not supposed to do. And it will create over time an internalization of a new set of norms, a new set of beliefs of what is right for women to do. And so one of the things that I heard over and over is that it's my responsibility as a wife to align with my family. It's my responsibility as a woman in this household to support what the family wants, to do what the family wants. And so even if in a world where this wasn't how politics was structured, I would behave differently, this internalized oppression leads women to align with their households. And that means that even in the secret ballot, I wouldn't imagine voting for someone different because I can't imagine anything else. And that's reinforced by the fact that so much of this comes through the control of information. If I don't know anything but what the people in my home have told me, it becomes hard for my imagination set to expand beyond what I've been told, I'm supposed to see as my what's possible.
Well, so this kind of brings me to something else I wanted to ask you about, and in a way you've kind of already answered it, but let me bring it up because I think it might be interesting to our listeners, which is, what one of the things that really struck me in your book, Sole, is the extent to which men and women share similar ideas about gender norms and social behavior, right? And one might have thought that deep down inside, women might diverge with men when it comes to, say, issues like domestic abuse or violence against women. But in fact, if you look at some of the survey data and you talk about this explicitly, women's and men's views aren't that different. And so I guess in your understanding and given your field experience, is that convergence essentially a product of coercion?
I think it's a product of a norm of it is part of what patriarchy manifests as, in that. And it's maybe not a product of coercion, but a manifestation of it. That, there's this concept that in philosophy that I toyed with, but, was not quite, it didn't quite engage as deeply with, but of the difference between autonomy and agency, or coercion and oppression. And, an example that I read that I thought was really telling here is the example of sort of skin lightening. That in a context like India or elsewhere in the world, when the value of white skin is so high, people will choose to go and lighten their skins. But if you can imagine a world where there wasn't this value placed on lighter skin, then those same people would not make that choice. That's a choice because it's a function of the way that society is structured and the power that's allocated, and what gets rewarded and what might get punished. And so I guess in that way, it is, when we think about women's acceptance of domestic violence, which is as high and in fact higher than men in India, I see it as sort of the same thing. It's proof of the depth of the norm of male dominance, that becomes inculcated as self-protection. You start to see that as the way things are, and survival means abiding by those norms. And that's, of course, then perpetuated through the joint family that creates hierarchies among women. So then if part of this norm is that mother-in-laws have power over daughter-in-laws, so you now have a stake in perpetuating some of this. It's then, of course, perpetuated by strengths of attachment to the home and limitations of how much information you get to challenge it. But all to say, it's maybe a complicated answer but to say that this is where I think it's important to recognize that it has the depth of patriarchy is so strong as to have created an acceptance of the social norm. But I do want to just be clear that doesn't mean that if things were to change, if new possibilities were to be imaginable, that doesn't mean that women wouldn't choose those. It's just that to survive within the current imagination set, you have to accept some of what is put in front of you. And so I see it as evidence of coercion, of the potential for coercion, and, the desire to survive amidst that.
So you just touched on this, Sole, but I just want to pick up quickly on something you said, and it has to do with the kind of particular form patriarchy takes in India, right? When we have conversations about social norms or politics in India, we hear a lot about patriarchy. But could you just kind of tell us from your view, are there distinctive ways patriarchy functions in India, say, compared to other peer countries in South Asia or, elsewhere in the world?
Absolutely. And, one thing I want to note is that patriarchy exists almost everywhere in the world. It makes, studying it very hard because we have almost no variance in whether you don't have patriarchy or not. But the form that it takes does look very different. And India, I think, it's known, Denise Candioti has this fantastic article called The Patriarchal Bargain, that documents the difference between patriarchy in South Asia and patriarchy in parts of Africa, and how you see very different outcomes despite sort of the core belief of male dominance being the same, because that's what patriarchy is. It's sort of this core expectation that men dominate. But in India, you get patriarchy coinciding with patrilineality, so sort of inheritance passing through the male line, and patriarchality. And I think that latter part is really important. So co-residence with men's families. So women, the expectation that women migrate and care for the joint family of their husband. And so in general, what I think this means is that we observe for all of these things, for the existence of dowry and the way that marriage markets are structured, the way that elder care is structured, all of the things that coincide with patriarchy, what we observe is what's often coined as a stronger form of patriarchy, because it leads to a desire for women, or an outcome where women don't participate in the labor market as much as elsewhere. And so that then creates very strong differences in economic resources between men and women. And so that then just exacerbates male dominance of most spaces. It also really centers women's lives in the home as being the care providers to children and to the elderly.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, we've touched on a lot of different aspects of the book, Sole, and I think it might be useful for just to kind of step back for a second. And because your book has, many interlocking pieces, right? The first piece is an argument that says, look, the household is the primary unit of political decision-making in rural India, in places like Madhya Pradesh, for instance. A second element is the fact that if you look at women's political participation, it aligns with the strategic interests of men in their household, given all of the kinds of inequalities in bargaining and household power and in coercive power, as you just eloquently described. And then the next piece of it is that, what comes out of this is a political system at a kind of meta level or macro level that's sustained by women's political, subordination. But I don't want our listeners to think that that's the there's only gloom and doom, because there is a kind of positive or more hopeful aspect to the story, which is that when women act collectively under certain conditions, that can boost their agency and autonomy. And I think here we kind of come full circle to where we started this conversation, talking about self-help groups in Madhya Pradesh. So, before we get to that part of your argument, just tell us a little bit about this movement, right? Where did it come from? How far have these self-help groups proliferated in India? How would you describe or characterize the role they play in Indian society today?
Yeah. I appreciate you taking us back to both where the story started, because it started for me as a story of incredible optimism. In fact, one of the things that made me really passionate about this is that I got to the field. I talked to so many women who have transformed their communities. And I observed this transformation in a way that I was envious of. I wanted to understand how, according to all of our models, this is a context where women should be, as far from being able to achieve sort of empowerment and control of politics. And yet that's where I started, was trying to understand how that happened, and it came down, as you mentioned, to self-help groups, and we can talk about the how in a bit, but what are these groups? And so, I think the easiest definition of a self-help group is that they are, typically just microcredit groups, but unlike other microcredit groups, they aren't necessarily always, they're rarely organized by banks. They'll get bank linkages at some point. And unlike many of these groups in other parts of the world, and one thing I think that's really important about the Indian context is they don't have an end date. These are groups of women who come together indefinitely to leverage their collective strength to sort of build their resources, but also to solve problems. And this movement in India started back in the 80s, and was largely an NGO-based movement that happened in different parts of India with strong roots in both Rajasthan and Kerala, sort of taking this on where there were NGOs, groups that you've probably heard of, Seva, Pradhan, that started by organizing women into these groups with the aim of helping them get financial empowerment. Sort of the core of this was, how do we get women access to finances? How do we improve incomes? And then ultimately, this was built on a model of how does rural India develop? And that entails sort of more resource distribution. A lot of this was about how do we improve agricultural yields, and organizing groups of women enables sort of access to groups that you can then share learnings about different kinds of crop techniques. And so this was really a development movement that women were the core of. And it was largely carried out by NGOs through the 90s, with a lot of expansion into some states more than others based on where they worked, and with some government funding, particularly starting in the early 2000s. But, most of that work was the government supporting existing NGOs to carry out that work. And so the SHG movement was strong and deep, but was, I wouldn't say, so prolific until the 2010s. And that's when we really see things change in the nature of that movement. And particularly in 2015, when the government took this on as national policy with an aim of sort of getting as many women into SHGs as possible through the National Rural Livelihoods Mission. Since 2015, we should check these numbers, but I think something like, 100 million households have now been enrolled into SHGs across India by the government. And so this has now become sort of, I would argue, probably the largest women's financial empowerment initiative in the world, built on what was a sort of very deep context-specific learning that NGOs started.
So I think, what's so interesting is exactly how you phrase that last line, right? I mean, this was a really powerful financial inclusion, financial empowerment initiative. It was set up for ostensibly apolitical reasons. But as you document in the book, women who are part of self-help groups do experience greater autonomy and agency when it comes to politics, right? So I guess my question for you is, how did these groups, which had nothing to do with politics, end up propelling women's political participation, right? And was that a completely kind of accidental or inadvertent spillover of these groups and their foundation?
Yeah, a really important question. And I think a complicated answer. So I think this is where the key lies in the fact that these are groups that have been together for a long time and that have this long time horizon attached to them. And so the average group that I studied had been meeting together for over 6 years. And at the extreme, some of the groups that I met with had been meeting together for 25 years. And so, just imagine that you came together with a group of your friends every week, every 2 weeks for 25 years. Like eventually the rote sort of return of let's talk about how much I've saved, what I'm spending my money on is going to become, you're going to grow weary of it. Like you've now lived your life with these people. You've seen them raise their kids. You've seen them grapple with the challenges. And those are exactly the challenges that lead people to go to the government. I've dealt with some crisis and my crop yields failed, or my home got destroyed, or my child needs healthcare, or, I'm widowed unexpectedly and my source of income is gone. And so in just talking about daily life, politics is ever present. And so what I observed in many of these groups is, while I won't say it was accidental, I don't know that it was always infused. Someone didn't have to come in and say, now talk about politics. But just in the course of discussing your needs and your experiences, women developed, because they have strong solidarity, they were able to come to each other to brainstorm. They supported each other. They wanted each other to thrive and survive. I mean, these now, like, I would say it goes even beyond friends. The word that I heard most often was that these are my family, the women in these groups. And so they wanted to support their family and help them achieve that. And what power did these women have? They had the power through their collective to do so. That said, just to sort of end the thought, I do think that as the organizing groups, the NGOs and the government started to become aware of the value of the collective action that can emerge from these groups, we do now see a lot more infusion of, people saying you should try to go and attend Gram Sapa because that's where you can get better access to entitlements. If you need more Narega work, you should go make claims. We now even today see a lot of emphasis being placed on, thinking about how to integrate self-help groups in, for example, the GPDP, the Panchayat budgeting process. Like there's a specific sort of line in the database on how many SHG members were present in those conversations. And so I think now it is far less sort of inadvertent and has become a more formalized relationship between these institutions.
But there is a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back logic or dynamic even here, right? Because one of the things you show towards the end of the book is like, look, it is true that women can gain autonomy from the household, and they can challenge this male-dominated patriarchal political order by collectively acting, right, thanks to the resources they've been endowed with through these self-help groups. But there are a lot of costs, and there can oftentimes be a lot of backlash. So tell us a little bit about, when the cost-benefit actually works in women's favor to exercise greater voice in politics.
Yeah, I think my answers to this, I think, mirror my general thoughts on women's empowerment more generally, which is that, if we really think about what empowerment is, it's about challenging existing power structures, which means the people at the top of those power structures are probably not going to be happy about that. The men who have dominance over women who would lose that won't be happy if that fundamentally transformed. That doesn't mean, as a note, that all men wouldn't be happy, but that those who have a stake in the prevailing system will resist change to their power. And so if we think about women's empowerment generally, which is, I think, the SHG movement fits so perfectly within, there's sort of 2 options you have. You can work within social norms. You can work within the existing power structures. You can bring men on board, and you'll see change. And I think, we could even have a chat if you're interested in what I think the current sort of upsurge in women's voting means within that framework and how it fits with now parties actively targeting women. It's a version of this. Like the sort of traditional power holders are now on board with some forms of women's participation. But I think a challenge to that is that it's either going to be the change in norms is going to be slow because you're not going to get this radical transformation of power, or what is possible to be achieved is going to be limited. Um, you know, there are things that women want that are generally quite desirable, and nobody would contest. Women want better schooling for kids. That's a hard thing to say. I don't want better schooling for kids. And so in that regard, there are things and strategies that can be taken by these groups that are less costly. But what's costly is if you really want to challenge norms directly. If what you want is power, if what you want is access, if what you want is protection from coercion, because that's the mechanism of power. And so what I observed is that the women who really tried, who wanted that, who wanted to challenge norms, who wanted a bit more of a radical transformation. And I hate to say that, things like protection from violence is a radical transformation, but that's part of it. That's where backlash was the strongest and most strident. And so, it's high cost. I think with that, and so I think it then emerged when both women felt they could bear those costs, when their solidarity was strong enough, when they felt they had the capacity, the strength as a group to really make change. But I think it's also worth noting that it's high cost because it's high benefit. And, so often that these groups transformed in that way because, they felt like some of their lives depended on it. And so then you bear the cost to doing so. But, in other cases, I also observed less of the challenge of those deeper things because the costs were too high. And so, I'll leave it at that. But it is, I think, an important thing to consider the trade-offs between is like what it means. A question I ask a lot of people is what would it mean to have complete transformation of power, complete erosion of patriarchy without backlash? Is that possible? And I think, in some ways, the fact that some of these women chose to engage in politics in the way they did, chose to push for what they did, knowing full well that they would likely experience resistance and backlash. Like, this was new information to me. To them, this was their life. Like they knew they were violating the contract that they were supposed to serve, and they chose to do that because they felt it was worth it. I think that to me is the most telling part of why and why someone might take on that kind of action.
But so I think if you take what you just said on board, Soleil, and I think it's a very powerful argument, and it completely resonates with me, then maybe that should temper a little bit of our optimism about the fact that yes, we are seeing more women turn out to vote. We are seeing more women as political candidates at the state and national levels. Of course, at the panchayat level, we have reservation. But we're not really seeing a huge surge in numbers of elected officials at higher levels. We, of course, Parliament has passed a bill to reserve 1/3 of state and national legislative seats for women, although we don't know exactly when that's going to be implemented. But is it sort of safe to say that based on what you've just said, that, progress is likely to be slow again because some of these gains are incredibly hard fought, and the backlash that ensues, it further drives up those transaction costs?
Yeah. I mean, I think that progress is slow. I think that there is, and I think it's slow in both cases. And there, I don't know that I think women's empowerment can be done by Band-Aid, nor do I think there's an easy solution to it. I don't want to diminish the fact that progress is progress. Seeing women turn out to vote and articulate a voice and see that they now, there's a norm shift that we're amidst in India, where women have the right to that voice. And, that is progress. But at the same point in time, it's not like women's labor force participation rates have dramatically changed, despite the fact that so many of the policies that women were promised were around exactly that issue. The new wave of evidence is showing that many of those policies are actually not changing the things that they were hoped to change. And so it is, I think when progress is at the hands of the people who have a stake in the power system, it's always going to be constrained. And so it's likely to be slow. I think I guess my conclusion would be two things. One is that we should all just remember that patriarchy resists its challenges and it reasserts itself. It just does so in new ways, which means that the policies that we implement to empower women can never be seen as just one and done. It's always going to be a game of whack-a-mole until the fundamental underlying sort of power structures have changed. And, I think where India is at today is that we're playing a slightly different game of whack-a-mole than we were before, and women have made progress, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep our focus on thinking about what the new challenges that emerge are going to be and how, we can continue to protect and sort of allow for space for women to have a voice.
My guest on the show this week is the political scientist Soledad Artiz Prillaman. She's the author of an award-winning new book, The Patriarchal Political Order, The Making and Unraveling of the Gendered Participation Gap in India. It has just won the Victoria Shuck Award for the best book published on women in politics, presented by the American Political Science Association. And in fact, Sole is in Philadelphia to do many things, but one of them will be picking up this award. And I hope that when you're talking about the book, you have a slide with whack-a-mole being shown, because I think that's a really vivid illustration of your argument. But so congrats on the book. It's really a terrific read. I learned so much. I know you have a very busy couple of days ahead of you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Millen, for having me and for this wonderful conversation.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.